Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us again this morning for our webinar. Today it is on creating and editing with tag-based or else variable-based. You can also go by that as well. Um, it's roughly about 18 minutes or so, and if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in and we'll get to them at the end.
Welcome to today's tutorial. Let's get started. Let's have a look at our agenda for today. Today we're looking at the Cscape Program Variables window, which is the primary tool for creating and editing variables in Cscape. We'll also look at how to edit variables as text from a CSV spreadsheet or using a text editor. We'll have demonstrations throughout, and as always we'll finish with the Q&A session. Before we look at tag-based, or what we call variable-based advanced ladder in Cscape, first we'll look at a register-based advanced ladder because that's the version of Cscape that's been around the longest. In register-based advanced ladder, all variables that you create must be tied to specific OCS memory locations. The tool for naming your variables in register-based advanced ladder is called the IO_name dialog box, and when you assign a variable a name, it's called an IO name. When you want to work on many variables at once using a tool other than Cscape, then copying and pasting from the IO names window to Excel or another spreadsheet program is the quickest method. With tag-based or variable-based advanced ladder, on the other hand, the primary tool is the Program Variables window. It's used for creating and editing variables, and it's available from the Tools menu, and that window is dockable if desired. Next, let's look at how the Program Variables window is organized. From top to bottom, you'll find different groups of variables, including global variables, retained variables, etc. And across the top, from left to right, you'll see different properties of your variables, including things like name, type, dimension, etc. Now we'll look at all that in detail. So let's start with the variable groups. From top to bottom, the first group you'll come across is the global variables. So what are global variables? In your global variables, first you have the variables and arrays that are mapped to real-world I/O. Normally, you don't have to map your variables to memory locations with tag-based or variable-based advanced ladder, but if you have a particular digital input, output, or analog signal that's tied to a pin on the I/O terminal strip on the OCS, you need to make sure that that specific I/O pin gets tied to that specific variable you've just created, meaning you need to map that variable to a real-world I/O register, such as the I's, Q's, AI's, and AQ's. Other variables within the global variable group could be variables and arrays that are mapped to system bits and system variables, like always on or always off, for example. The last thing that you would put inside the global variable list would be any simple variables that are not array variables that you want to be non-retentive. The next group going down in that list is the retained variables. This is where the majority of the program variables will reside and where you'll put most of the variables that you create that you want to use in your project. You'll also see groups of variables for subroutines, user-defined function blocks, and structures. When you open a new variable-based advanced ladder project, you won't find any entries in the program variable window for subroutines or UDFBs. However, as soon as you create a subroutine or user-defined function block in your project, you'll find a variable group that will show up in the variable window. Lastly, we have structures. There are some structures that are predefined in Cscape that you'll find by default in the program variable window, such as structures that are associated with the PID instruction, and structures associated with timers and counters either with a 16-bit accumulator or 32-bit accumulator. Now let's talk about the variable properties from left to right. First, there's name, as your variable has to have a name. Next, you have type, which is the data type, for example, integer, double integer, real, boolean, or it could also be a variable that's tied to a structure or UDFB. Next, you have dimension. Dimension is used with an array of variables. So if you create a variable with a dimension of 8, then you create an array of 8 variables which you can reference anywhere between index 0 through index 7 to retrieve them. Next, you have the attribute column. That column is only really used with UDFBs. Any variables that are input variables, output variables, or private variables for your UDFB will show up in the attribute column. There's another column called initial value, but in Cscape 9.9 that's not functional. If you're using IEC 61131 language, you do have an active column for initial value, but it's not active with Cscape 9.9 and variable-based advanced ladder. The next column is the user group. This is an organizational feature you can use to subcategorize your variables. For example, if you have a machine with multiple functions, you could decide that all the variables associated with a specific function would be within a user group with that function name. The next column is the memory column. You use that column to assign a specific memory address to a variable. Again, if it's a real-world I/O point, in that case you need to assign a specific memory location to it. Last week's webinar was about Modbus communications, and that is another scenario where you have to assign some memory locations to specific variables. Finally, there's a description column where you can add descriptive text for your variable. Now let's look at the default variables that you'll find in the global variable group. At the very top, you'll find 4 real-world arrays. Those are named AI, AQ, I, and Q. Those are arrayed variables that are dimensioned to the total size of digital inputs, digital outputs, analog inputs, and analog outputs in the OCS. You use these when you're adding remote I/O, for example smart rail or smart sticks, etc. You need to tie the I/O points for those I/O blocks to real-world I/O using those real-world I/O arrays. The remaining default variables you'll find in your global variables are system bits such as always on, always off, and the flashers for 1 second on and off contact. There are also variables that are tied to system registers like the real-time clock, user screens, alarm screens, etc. Those are pre-configured for convenience. Next, let's look at using the program variable window in your application. Using the window itself to add or edit a variable one at a time is a very effective approach, especially for a small project where you may only have a few variables. It's also effective for changing variables that are already deployed in your program. For example, if you have a variable called pump motor with many contacts and coils scattered throughout your program that are tied to that variable, and you decide you want to rename that variable by changing that variable name in the program variable window, Cscape will then ask if you want to perform a replace all operation and automatically replace that variable name that you just changed throughout your program. The program variable window is also good for adding variables as you go. Next, let's begin our demonstration using the program variable editing window. So first, I'll open Cscape. I have a program here, as you can see, and the program variable window is in the center of the screen. You can see we have the different variable groups, including my global variables. Here's all the ones that were in there by default. Here's my retained variables with all my variables that I've added in. We also have a subroutine. These are variables that are specifically tied to a subroutine. They're listed under linearize, which is the name of that subroutine. We also have a user-defined function block, so all the variables associated with it are shown here. Under attributes, it shows you that this is an input variable, and we have 4 of those in total. Then we also have 1 output variable in this UDFB, and there aren't any private variables. Then we have our structures and our predefined structures for PID. These are all the variables that are tied to PID. Then here's your structure for 16-bit accumulator timers and counters, and for 32-bit accumulator timers and counters. And then here's a structure that I put in named motor. These are the different elements within the motor structure. So if I had multiple motors that I wanted to use in my application, then I could create a retained variable with the type set to motor, and then I'll have all those sub-variables available to me that were defined as part of the structure. So that's how the different groups are arranged in the program variable window. Next, let's add a variable. So I'll go to the retained variable area. Let's say I want to create a variable called motor overload. Under retained variables, I'll right click and hit add variable. I could also hit the insert button on my keyboard. Then I'll name that variable motor overload. It's a Boolean variable, and let's say in this case that the motor overload is wired to a digital input I3, so I need to map that directly. I'll assign it here to %I3. If this variable was not tied to a real-world input or not being sent over Modbus, I'd have no reason to fill in this memory column. The best practice when you have variables that are tied to real-world I/O points is to put them in the global variables group, not the retained group. You can move variables from group to group easily. So I'll click and hold on this variable and I'll drag it to the global variable group, and now you can see that variable has been moved into that group. Next, let's look at how to edit a variable. Let's say I want to rename this sensor1 raw variable, and instead of sensor1 I'll name it sensor underscore pressure underscore raw. So I renamed that variable, and now Cscape asks me if I want to update existing variable references with the new name. I'm going to say yes, and now any place in my program where I use that old reference, it will change the name to the new one. Next, let's talk about different techniques for editing variables all at once as opposed to one at a time, as well as techniques for importing and creating multiple variables at once. To do all that, we'll use a feature called editing variables as text. So how do we do that? Well, to do that, we highlight the group that we want to work on, whether it's the global variables, retained variables, etc. Then right click, and from that menu we'll select edit variables as text. After we select that, our Cscape view is going to change. The variable window is going to get larger, and we get the choice of viewing the variables in either a text format called IEC format, in XML format, or in CSV format. I also want to point out an option that you'll see when you right click on that group earlier in this step, which is called Load IO Names from File. That feature is currently not active in Cscape 9.9 Service Pack 6 and earlier, and is only currently enabled for when you're using the IEC mode for logic editing in Cscape. Next, let's quickly talk about what it looks like when we go into edit variables as text. As you can see, those three options for editing variables are organized into tabs. Here are screenshots of each of the three individual tabs from the same list of global variables, with the IEC format on the left, XML in the center, and then CSV format on the right. Let's start with the first option, which is using IEC. This is a text format and is the easiest way to edit variables all at once. It can be convenient if you want to add variables that are similar to variables you've already created. Then you can quickly copy and paste within this window and then do some text editing to create the new variables. You could also copy and paste to your favorite text editor and work on it there, and then paste it back into Cscape. As an alternative to the IEC format, you can also use XML. It's a bit more complicated and there's a few more fields there that you have to deal with, but if you're interested in editing the text in XML, that option is available to you. Finally, we have CSV format. This format is best if you want to go back and forth between a spreadsheet program like Microsoft Excel for editing. You do have to be careful because the CSV format has a lot of extra data fields, so you have to follow the format carefully. You could also create a macro to make sure that gets done properly and to save yourself some work. Next, let's begin our demonstration where we'll look at that edit variables as text option in Cscape. So I'll open Cscape and we're back at our program variable window. I'll go into the retained variable group and then right click and select edit variables as text. You'll notice that our window expanded and now we have three tabs: IEC format, XML format, and then CSV format. Let's go back to the IEC format first. If I wanted to use a text editor for this, I would just hit Ctrl A to select all and then Ctrl C to copy. Then I would paste that into the text editor and work on the text. I'd add variables, change variables, etc., being careful that if you do change existing variables that have been used elsewhere in your program, you're going to have to manually go back and make those changes yourself. However, if you're just adding variables, that's not a big deal. If you just want to add some variables here, you can also edit right from Cscape. So let's say I want to add another variable. I'll give it a similar name, and I'm just going to follow the format. So I've added one variable. I could add many more. Now when you're done editing with this format, press the X here to get out of this mode, and then if you've made any changes, Cscape will detect that and ask if you want to save these changes. So if I go to that retain variable group, you can see that variable I added in is there. Next, let's look at using CSV format. I'll click on retain variables again, and I'll right click and go to edit variables as text. This time I'll select the CSV format tab. Once again, I'll hit Ctrl A to select everything and Ctrl C to copy to clipboard. Then I'll open up a spreadsheet program. I'll use Microsoft Excel. And in my empty spreadsheet, I'll make sure that my cursor is located in the first cell. Then I go into view the available macros, and I have one created called paste from Cscape. I'll run that macro, and now we see that data from Cscape is in a much more usable or readable format. Now let's say I want to add some variables. So I want to add a series of variables called LED1 through LED8. I could use an array for that, but in this case I'll do it this way to show how I might use Excel or a spreadsheet program as a convenient tool for editing or creating my variables. So in here I'll type in LED1 real and no for read only. That's what that column RO stands for. I'll type another one in here, LED2. So far this isn't any faster than a text editor, but now I can stretch this down, and once that's complete I'll have 8 variables for LED1 through LED8. Next I'll go back to my macros, and I'm going to view the macros again. This time I'll select Export to Cscape. I'll run that macro, so that should have copied that data in the format that it needs to be in for Cscape. Now I can go back to Cscape and I'll delete the text that was there, and I'll hit Ctrl V to paste. And you can see there's those extra variables that I added in when I was in Excel. And I'll hit X again, and it's asking me if I want to save, and I'll say yes. Then I'll go back into retained variables, and there are my variables. Remember, unlike when you're editing directly with the program variable window, when you edit variables as text, you need to be careful that you're not changing any variables that you've already used throughout your program, or else you're going to have to manually go in and make those changes. So that's our demonstration complete. Thank you for joining me for today's tutorial, and the Q&A session will begin shortly.
Okay, a nice basic run through of what's seen on the variables window using tag-based or variable-based as it can also be called. So I'll take you to my screen now. So upcoming, we do have the next of our IEC videos. That is next week, and then that's followed by user security, the OCS bootloader, and then screen organization following that to the end of July. As always, if there's one that you've missed and you want to go back on, we have all of them uploaded to this section of the website. And if there's anything that hasn't been done and you would like to see it, just drop us a message and we'll see if we can fit it into the schedule. Other than that, thank you all for joining us this morning, and we hope to see you again next week.